Basic concepts of environmental ethics. In this lecture, I will cover some terminology. I'll also draw some conceptual distinctions that are significant in environmental ethics. I'll cover a lot of ground, which requires lack of depth, and in some cases, precision. If something draws your attention and you would like to hear more about it, or it doesn't make sense, please let me know. Let's start with environmental ethics, a branch of philosophy. It tries to answer the following questions. Are humans the only things that matter morally? If not, what else does, and why? What approach to ethical theory should we adopt? Should we be ethical monists or pluralists? You might be wondering what I mean by something mattering morally. Mattering morally is synonymous with having moral status. When something has moral status, we should take that thing, its well-being, and perhaps rights, into account when we make decisions. Consider a scenario, for instance, in which your house is on fire and you have to choose between saving a dog versus saving a floor vacuuming robot. Most people wouldn't have to think. Clearly, the dog should be saved instead of the robot because robots don't matter except their material value. But dogs, most people would agree, have a value that is not reducible to a money amount. A dog, unlike a robot, has moral status. That's why I should take the dog into account when I'm deciding what to save from the fire, but not the robot. Environmental ethicists also talk about rights, which are entitlements. Some of these entitlements are to perform or not perform a certain action. For instance, imagine that you are stopped by the police and asked a bunch of questions. In this setting, you have a legal right to remain silent. They cannot force you to answer. That's your Fifth Amendment right, at least here in the United States. Some rights entitle their owners that others perform or not perform certain actions. Again, the US Constitution provides an example. If National Guard came to your house and asked if they can crash on your couch for a few days, you can refuse. The Third Amendment entitles you that they shall not enter your house. Of course, these are both examples of legal rights. Some, if not most people, think that legal rights are derived from moral rights. Such people claim that you have a moral right to remain silent. Law enforcement has no moral authority to coerce you to speak. And this would have been so even if the law allowed torture to coerce a confession from you. But this is an issue that is being disputed by moral and political philosophers. Some think that moral rights exist, and they provide a foundation for legal rights. But some think that the only kind of right that exists is legal rights. According to these philosophers, there is no such thing as a moral right. Some such philosophers think that the concept of a moral right might be even incoherent. But we aren't going to try to settle this issue here. All I want you to notice is that some disagreements in environmental ethics might cut deep into the metaphysics of rights and philosophy of law. What might look like a disagreement about whether, let's say, animals have rights or not, for instance, might turn out to be a disagreement about what kind of a thing a right is. Moving on. Rights are more narrowly understood than moral status. Some things may have moral status, but no rights. But everything that has rights also has moral status. It is also fair to ask, what are those things that have moral status? Here, there is again disagreement among ethicists. One view is Anthropocentrism. The word, which literally means human-centered, should give you a hint about what this view is about. There are two versions of Anthropocentrism. According to the strong version, only humans have moral status. On the weak version, other things can also have moral status, but humans have much higher moral status than others. For instance, you could be a weak anthropocentrist and still believe that you have a moral obligation to save the dog from the fire. This is so because although you don't think that the dog is as morally valuable as a human, it is still morally valuable a little bit. And the robot has no moral value. So, save the dog. Weak anthropocentrists don't have to stop at dogs. They can ascribe moral value to all sorts of living beings, from frogs to forests. You might be thinking, strong anthropocentrism is horrible because those people care only about humans and nothing but humans. But not necessarily. Human existence and comfort are largely dependent on the existence and health of other living beings. So even a strong anthropocentrist can ascribe extrinsic or instrumental moral status to non-humans. For instance, the dog itself doesn't matter morally, but a human will be sad if it dies in a house fire. That's why the dog should be saved. Or the Amazon rainforest doesn't matter in and of itself, but if we completely destroy it, humans will have to live the rest of their miserable lives in a post-apocalyptic dystopia. Among environmental ethicists, anthropocentrism is a dirty word. It is often used as an insult or as a way of dismissing someone's views, like, don't listen to Adam, he's an anthropocentrist. This might make you wonder why anyone would be an anthropocentrist. We can identify many reasons, but two of them are the most popular. First, one might claim that humans are unique in being rational and autonomous, and rationality and autonomy are necessary conditions for moral status. Or you can claim that humans have the highest degree of sentience by far, which is supposed to confer to them unique or relatively high moral status. Let's think a bit more about each reason for being an anthropocentrist. First is the claim that humans are unique in being rational and autonomous. A fair question to ask here would be, is the claim true? Are humans really unique in being rational and autonomous? A second question also needs an answer. Is humans being unique in this respect a sufficient reason to be an anthropocentrist? A second popular reason for anthropocentrism is sentience and the claim that humans have a lot more of it. To understand what this reason is about, first we need to define sentience. Sentience is the ability to feel. Here we understand feeling broadly. Anything that can experience pleasure or pain or can sense the outside world is sentient. Of course, you might say there are degrees of sentience. For instance, a dog is more sentient than a robot vacuum cleaner. Although the robot vacuum cleaner can see in some sense of the word, the dog can experience much more than the most sophisticated robot could. Similarly, I would like to imagine that I am more sentient than a dog. Am I right though? Are humans much more sentient than other living beings? And once more, you can even question whether a higher degree of sentience would be sufficient for ascribing unique or much higher moral status to humans. Another useful term to understand what is happening in environmental ethics is extensionism. Extensionism is any argument or point of view claiming that moral status is not unique to humans and can be extended to others. There are two ways of doing this. First, you can be an individualist and see individual organisms as the primary holders of moral status. Or you can be a holist and see species and or ecosystems as the primary holders of moral status. Let's look at individualism a bit more closely. On individualism, the question, who should I save from the fire, has a sensible answer. The dog, as an individual organism, holds moral status. That's why you should factor him in your decisions. Explaining why systems of organisms matter is complicated on individualism. A forest, for instance, is nothing but the sum total of every organism making up the forest. Therefore, its moral status is just the aggregate of the moral status of those organisms. Besides, on individualism, we can't ascribe moral status to things like rainfall patterns because such things are not individual organisms, although they may be vital for the survival of organisms. Finally, depending on whether you are an anthropocentrist or not, you might answer questions such as what is the moral status of mosquitoes differently. After all, some mosquitoes carry diseases such as malaria, which are directly responsible for nearly 1 million human deaths every year. If you're an anthropocentrist, you might believe that those mosquitoes have no moral value and should be eradicated. The alternative to individualism is holism, the idea that species or ecosystems are the primary holders of moral status. There are two versions of holism. First, there is species holism, which claims that species are the primary holders of moral status. Here, it might be difficult to explain why the mosquito has any moral status whatsoever. Such species, you might think, cause nothing but misery and death unto others. Then, there is the ecocentric holism, according to which ecosystems are the primary holders of moral status. Here you can explain why it might be a bad idea to make mosquitoes extinct. After all, they might play a vital role in the health of an ecosystem. If we render them extinct, that might set in motion a cascade of events that could damage the whole tree of life. Now I will invite you to think a bit more about each version of holism. Let's start with species holism. Does species holism strike you as true? And if it were true, what implications would it have? We can question ecocentric holism similarly. Is ecocentric holism true? And if it were true, what implications would it have? Another thing you should know about is what philosophers call ethical theories. They are also called moral theories. There are three influential moral theories: consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. Consequentialism is the claim that the morally correct action is the one that generates the best possible outcome. Deontology is quite a bit more nebulous, but you can summarize it as the claim that the morally correct action is the one that fulfills our moral duties and or respects the rights of others. Finally, virtue ethics is the claim that the moral person is the virtuous person, and the morally correct action is the virtuous action. Let's try to understand each theory a bit better. Let's start with consequentialism. Here, it is fair to ask, what makes an outcome the best outcome? There are many answers to this question, but one that is most relevant to environmental ethics is this: the best outcome is the maximum amount of organismic flourishing or ecosystem health. Here's how this theory can be applied to a concrete problem. Suppose we are trying to move towards renewable sources of energy. We have a number of possible choices, such as building more hydroelectric plants, more wind farms, or solar arrays. According to consequentialism, to decide which one is the morally correct course of action, we need to figure out how each action will affect the flourishing of organisms and the health of the ecosystem. Building a large hydroelectric power plant, for instance, could severely disrupt the migration patterns of freshwater fish and draw them to extinction, eventually taking out the predators for those fish along. That seems really damaging to the organismic flourishing and ecosystem health. Or we can build enormous wind farms. Those can hurt birds. Or we can build large solar arrays which require significant storage, production, and maintenance. Those also can be extremely damaging to the ecosystem. Which one then? To answer that question, we should quantify the benefits and harms as objectively as possible, tally them for each option, and compare. Only that comparison can give us the morally correct answer, according to consequentialists. Is consequentialism plausible? What do you think? Next, there is deontology, according to which the morally correct action is the one that fulfills our moral duties and or respects others and their rights. I know this one is vague. To figure out what it means, we need to first figure out what our duties are. Famously, one answer to this question is universalizability, which is something we covered in the previous lecture. According to this answer, an action fulfills our moral duties if its maxim can be willed as a universal law. The application of this idea is a bit more complicated than consequentialism, for it requires us to extract the maxim from an action, imagine a world in which every agent acts on that maxim, and question whether the purpose behind that maxim can be achieved by everyone in that imaginary world. But that's not all. Deontology also puts an emphasis on respect. But how do we respect others in the context of the environment? Again, one influential answer is this: we can be respectful by never treating organisms and ecosystems merely as a means to an end. To see what that means, consider factory farms where animals are raised in terrible conditions. Why? Because people want to eat them. We are treating those animals merely as a means to an end, merely as a vessel for the meat, eggs, and milk their bodies will produce. How could it be otherwise? How can we not treat organisms and the ecosystems around us merely as a means to an end? Of course, we should also question deontology, just like consequentialism. Is deontology plausible? The third theory you should know about is virtue ethics. According to virtue ethics, character traits of people is primary. Actions are secondary. The moral person is the virtuous person. The morally correct action is what a virtuous person would do. To understand how this can be, we need to first figure out what a virtue is and how to distinguish a virtuous character trait from others. There are, again, several answers among ethicists. The most sensible, at least in my opinion, works from examples such as kindness, generosity, gentleness, and compassion. So to be virtuous, and therefore moral, we need to figure out what a kind, generous, gentle, compassionate, yada 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 person would do. Here's an example of how one can be virtuous in the context of the environment. One may think, for instance, being frugal is a virtue. A person who doesn't waste resources is a virtuous person with regards to the environment, as their impact would be smaller. You can say similar things about compassion and gentleness. Once again, it is fair to ask whether this ethical theory is plausible or not. Finally, there's the issue of monism versus pluralism. One can be a monist or pluralist in three different ways. The first is monism and pluralism about the sources of moral status, more commonly referred to as moral values. We have already identified three sources: rationality, sentience, and organismic flourishing. But we could identify many others, such as justice, equality, and liberty. A value monist thinks that there is only one fundamental moral value. So among these values and many others, let's say only rationality is the fundamental one. Or liberty. All others, according to the value monist, are cashed out in terms of the fundamental value. For instance, a value monist who thinks that liberty is fundamental could argue that equality is also valuable, but only because and so far as it makes us free. Value pluralists disagree. They think that there are more than one fundamental moral value. A value pluralist could claim, for instance, both sentience and organismic flourishing are fundamental values. You cannot reduce the value of sentience into the value of organismic flourishing, and vice versa. You could also be a pluralist about ethical theories. Remember, there are three influential ethical theories. A pluralist might endorse one theory in one context and another in another context. For instance, one might be a deontologist about actions that affect humans and a consequentialist about actions that affect non-humans. Or one could be a theory pluralist by having a meta-theory that helps them prioritize the principles of ethical theories. Let's say my meta-theory says, first try to be virtuous. Failing that, do a consequentialist calculation. Or one might try to create a hybrid theory, or let's say consequentialism and deontology, in which we try to quantify respect as an outcome and maximize it with our actions. Last, there are the methodological pluralists. They argue that much of the to and fro about moral values and ethical theories is a waste of time. They think that we don't need to change people's moral values and convince them of a specific ethical theory's truth. Let's say, in reality, organismic flourishing is the one true fundamental moral value. All else could be sacrificed for the sake of organismic flourishing. But imagine the society doesn't see it that way. All they care about is their sweet, sweet freedom. Similarly, there might be disagreement about theories. The true theory might be consequentialism. Whereas almost everyone is following an ancient form of virtue ethics and asking themselves, what would Jesus do? Methodological pluralist claims that we don't need to steer these people away from liberty and Jesus to align their behavior with a consequentialist ethics based on organismic flourishing. We just need to be a bit sneaky and manipulative to them. It's again fair to ask whether any one of these three kinds of monism or pluralism is plausible. What do you think? This brings me to the end of this lecture. Send me a message if you have any questions. Thank you for your patience, and I'll catch you next time.